The Satan Disciples started in the year 1959 by King Satan at the street corner of 15th and Talman in the North Lawndale neighborhood on Chicago's west side. They started on the east side of Douglas Park, which was not a major African-American neighborhood at that time. The vast majority of North Lawndale was African-American by 1959, but the last of the white element was east of the park. The Satan Disciples was founded mainly by Czechoslovakian and Polish white males, and they took in Mexican youths too that made up about half the gang. Some legends have claimed that the Satan Disciple name was an idea spawned from influence from the early Devil's Disciples, as the Devil's Disciples taught the Satan Disciples how to gangbang. This is not true at all. The Satan Disciples did not have any links to Black Gangster Disciples until 1978, when the Folk Alliance was established. The real origin of the name came from a priest that did community outreach in the area, came across the original SDs, and called them Devil's Disciples, and that gave the youths the idea to form the Satan Disciples. In the year 1960, the Satan Disciples opened up one of their most legendary chapters at 18th and California, Douglas Park, in the North Lawndale neighborhood, along with 14th and Washtenaw in North Lawndale. The Satan Disciples also landed in the near West Side community at Taylor and Racine the same year. In the same year, Satan Disciples also opened in the heart of Italy, West Pilsen, area at 18th and Oakley, which became another legendary section and was home to legendary members like Big Satch. Now the SDs were in 3 different neighborhoods within just 1 year of their existence. The original SDs fought against gangs like the Gaylords and the Latin Counts at the time. The Latin Kings did not have any territory or any foothold in any of the SD's sections back in the earliest years of the SD's existence. Therefore, the show Gangland on History Channel was not very accurate about SDs being formed because of the Latin Kings. The Latin Kings were not the #1 reason for Satan Disciples coming together. There were larger threats from Ambrose Latin Counts and Vice Lords that were much closer to SD turf, and Latin Kings didn't exist in the early 60s. By 1964, Latin Kings began pushing their way into the Pilsen and Little Village neighborhoods. Latin Kings wanted 18th Street in Pilsen and 26th Street in Little Village, and this did not fly well for the gangs that had already been there. The Latin Kings were able to set up massive territory along 26th Street, but 18th Street proved to be a major challenge for them, and that is partially credited to the Satan Disciples that held it down at 18th and California, and they would eventually spread to 18th and Rockwell in the North Lawndale neighborhood to further solidify their presence and keep Latin Kings out. The Latin Kings still were able to secure territory on 21 to 31st Street all through Pilsen and Little Village, but the SDs made it very hard for Latin Kings to exist there until Latin Kings turned the Coulter Counts into Coulter Kings in the late 60s, but that was all that the Latin Kings could settle in Pilsen. The original Satan Disciples were well-mannered and well-dressed and even had their own band. The only time they were not well-mannered is when they faced their enemies, and that was when the horns would come out. The SDs remained a very small fighting club in the 1960s, but managed to keep all their turf except 14th and Washtenaw, but that is because efforts were needed more on 18th Street, and because that neighborhood was changing racially, which is what caused the original chapter at 15th and Tallman to close. SDs did lose some numbers in the later 1960s due to some members getting drafted or enlisting to serve in the Vietnam War. However, those members were replaced by younger Mexican youths, but it still stunted the SD's ability to grow larger at the time. In the year 1966, the Satan Disciples may have had slower growth for a short time on 18th due to the war, but now new territory was opened at 24th and Washtenaw when Big Aggie and Little Aggie arrived in this Marshall Square neighborhood. This would become a legendary chapter that would eventually spread up and down 24th Street between California Ave and Western Ave. The biggest 24th sections would become 24th and Washtenaw and 24th and Rockwell. At 24th and California, Satan Disciples and Latin Kings would clash for many years as both groups claimed this territory. At the 24th Street territory, SDs also fought the Artistics and Morgan Deuces, Then later they fought 2-6 Kents and Cullerton Deuces by the 1970s. 24th Street opened alongside Mexican and Puerto Rican migration to Marshall Square in 1966. In 1971, King Satan was no longer the leader, and King Canary took over. It was in the early 1970s when a Satan disciple named King Fish flipped to become a gaylord. After he flipped, he convinced many white original SDs to become gaylords, and this began the 18th and Western Gaylords. These gaylords started because they felt threatened with the neighborhood becoming majority Mexican. As the 1970s progressed, Pilsen and Little Village became more and more gang-infested, and the gangs became more violent. The drug trade also became a larger phenomenon once the heroin trade began by 1970 on the streets of Chicago. Some of the older SDs got into the drug trade, but it was not rampant at all in the organization at the time, or really in any of the organizations back then, but it was present. Ambrose and Latin Counts were gunning for complete control of Pilsen, while Latin Kings were trying to dominate Little Village entirely. Satan disciples viciously fought all these gangs, and even 2-6 when they first started in 1970. In 1975, Satan disciples opened new turf on the northern part of Chicago in the southern part of the Westtown neighborhood. After the Gaylords left the area in 1975, the SDs were just moving in around Erie and Wood and Huron and Ashland areas. In this area, the SDs fought viciously with the C-notes in the area. This would begin a permanent chapter for the SDs. In 1977, SDs opened of their first piece of Southside territory outside of the Little Village neighborhood. From here, the Satan disciples opened more territory in Brighton Park and became a permanent part of Brighton Park. In the same year, Satan disciples were called upon for protection of the new Hispanic community in the Garfield Ridge neighborhood in the Sleepy Hollow area. The mostly white Insane Popes gang dominated Garfield Ridge and often targeted groups of Hispanic youths. Many of these youths joined the Satan disciples to fight back against the Popes and protect the Hispanic community. This section was one tough section and became a permanent chapter for the Satan disciples. In the year 1978, a significant amount of Satan disciples were now locked up in prison, including some original members. In April 1978, the Folk and People Nation alliances were created in Statesville Prison in a meeting directed by Larry Hoover, who was the leader of the Black Gangster Disciples. The purpose of this alliance was to organize the gang wars in prison and perhaps the streets. Hoover and David Barksdale had found allied white and Latino gangs throughout the 1970s to aid them in their wars with the vice lords. And it was rumored that the Satan disciples first encountered David Barksdale's black disciples back in the 1960s, and friendship was established especially since vice lords were trying to conquer everything on the west side of Douglas Park and North Lawndale. A pre-existing relationship between BGDs and BDs made for a smooth transition into the Folk Nation alliance. The SDs then reluctantly unified with the 2-6 and Ambrose, who also joined the Folk Nation, which brought these gangs together not only in the joint, but on the streets as well. Before this, SDs deeply hated Ambrose and were arch enemies back in the 60s and at least a good part of the 70s, especially after the leader of Ambrose, Luis Lemus, shot Mark Rodriguez in the leg and shot Fidel Perez at the corner of 16th and Fairfield in the North Lawndale neighborhood on October 19, 1974. People versus Rodriguez, 1980. Right after the SDs joined the Folk Nation, the first written constitution was drafted thanks in part to the influence of the BGDs. The Satan disciples would now operate with bylaws to follow that laid out the proper conduct that all members must abide by. The biggest benefit of the bylaws was it permitted free enterprise so that all members were allowed at any point in time to open legit businesses, just like how the Chicago outfit did it since the 1910s. This was definitely a major perk to being a SD. When Folk and People began in 1978, Satan disciples, 2-6 and 2-2 boys, formed an alliance called Insane. 2-6 and Satan disciples took it a step higher and became Insane Gangster. This alliance squashed most of the conflict between SDs and 2-6 and allowed them to do business together and with the Black Gangster Disciples. In the year 1980, the Satan Disciples opened up a legendary section at 51st and Wood in the back of the Yards neighborhood, alongside a new wave of Mexican migration to the neighborhood. In this neighborhood, SDs found rivalry with the Saints and fought other newly arriving gangs like Latin Kings and Bishops. In the year 1980, the SDs allied with Ashland Vikings, Maniac Latin Disciples, Milwaukee Kings, and Harrison Gents in their West Town section. This tightened up their relations with other folks in the area. In 1980, King Canary was no longer the leader of the SDs, and Agapito King Aggie Villalobos stepped into that role. Under King Aggie, the Satan Disciples opened up new territory throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s in other parts of the city, Chicagoland suburbs, and other states as membership swelled into the thousands. King Aggie was able to run the organization even after he was incarcerated in 1983 for armed robbery. The Satan Disciples had now opened several more sections in the heart of Chicago neighborhood and several more in Little Village. On the day of November 7, 1986, relations between Satan Disciples and 2-6 would reach a historic disruption. On this day, Ambrose gang members became infuriated with 2-6 from 28th Street over a girl and proceeded to drive to their neighborhood and shoot at them in the K-Town area of Little Village. 2-6 got revenge by crashing a party in the Marquette Park community at 63rd and Washtenaw held by Ambrose in their territory. A group of 2-6 opened fire into a crowd of partygoers, shooting 2 of Satan Disciples' gang members. After this, the Satan Disciples declared war on 2-6, which would become a legendary war that never ended. Because of this war, the 2-6 dropped the insane from their name and became just Gangster 2-6, while SDs remained Insane Gangster and 2-2 Boys were still insane. In the 1980s and first half of the 1990s, the SDs had spread into many Chicagoland suburbs, especially the suburb of Cicero in 1992. Bobby D and Waco D brought SDs to Cicero in 1992. The SDs opened up in Westmont, Downers Grove, Aurora, Bridgeview, Waukegan, West Chicago, Rockford, Kankakee, Calumet City, Berwyn, and Blue Island, just to name some. The Downers Grove, Westmont suburbs only lasted about 1987 to 1993, but for the many others I listed, they either went strong for a while or are still going strong today. It was at this point in time when the SDs started to make new enemies due to colonizing other neighborhoods, enemies such as the Saints, Noble Knights, 12th Street Players, TAP Boys, and more Vice Lord factions. In the year 1987, the Satan Disciples engaged in a very violent gang war with Harrison Gents and Milwaukee Kings in the southern West Town area. This war intensified in 1994 when a major shooting caused Milwaukee Kings and Satan Disciples to face incarceration. The Satan Disciples also went to war with Maniac Latin Disciples in 1994. In 1995, King Aggie was released from prison, but he soon found he was not embraced by all of the SDs. Many SDs told King Aggie that he should not be the leader, and that they wanted second-in-command Danny Gizmo Valencia to run the Satan Disciples as the new king. In November of 1995, Gizmo was shot and killed. It was said that his own gang killed him, more specifically, King Aggie supporters, and supposedly the hit was ordered by King Aggie. After that, the Satan Disciples never had another king. In the mid-1990s, SDs erupted into war with the Harrison Gents, C-Notes, and Milwaukee Kings. As the 1990s progressed, the SDs had grown into several thousands of members, becoming one of the largest street gangs in the city. Over time, some sections would pop up while others would close. The reason for the closure of certain sections was due to decisions to withdraw if an area was not profitable enough or if police presence was too strong. The SDs often function in a very organized crime manner and would only leave a turf if it was more profitable to invest more in another area. Using smart business sense, The SDs had grown their profits, opened several legit businesses, retained original territory, and opened new turf, and eventually would grow to have almost 10,000 members.